My name is Clara Mae Richardson, and for most of my 71 years, my peace was my pride. After losing my husband, Charles, I built my world around quiet moments, my morning coffee by the kitchen window, gospel humming through the house, and my 2 p.m. nap that my family knew better than to disturb. Or so I thought. I live in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the same red brick house Charles and I bought 40 years ago. The house creaks with age, smells faintly of lemon polish and old Bible pages, and every photo frame tells a story. My daughter, Tanya, lives across town with her husband, Marcus, and their 2 wild children, Jalen, 8, and Maya, 6. Tanya visits most weekends, and when she does, I always brace myself. She means well, but she was born with a stubborn streak as sharp as a tack. I love those grandbabies more than my own breath, but Lord knows, peace flies out the window the moment they step inside. See, I wasn't the kind of grandmother who spoiled kids with candy and chaos. I taught manners, respect, stillness. But Tanya, she called it old-fashioned. Mama, she'd say, laughing, you gotta let them be kids. And I'd say back, and you gotta let me rest, baby. This heart's not 25 anymore. That nap of mine wasn't just sleep. It was a boundary, a small act of self-preservation. But in this house, boundaries became something Tanya and Marcus thought they could rearrange. It started subtle, a laugh here, a door slam there. The grandkids running through the hallway while I tried to rest. I'd call out softly, Jalen, baby, Nana's resting. And he'd hush for about 3 seconds before starting again. But lately, it's like my peace became a joke. They'd come over and treat my living room like a playground, the walls echoing with cartoon songs and spilled juice. One Sunday, as I settled into my recliner with a throw blanket, my old gospel record spinning soft in the background, I heard Tanya whisper to Marcus in the kitchen. Mama's too uptight. She needs to loosen up. It's not like she's doing anything all day. That sentence stuck to my ribs like bad cornbread. Because it wasn't just disrespect, it was dismissal. After everything I'd done, raising her alone after her daddy's stroke, helping pay their rent when Marcus lost his job, she talked about me like I was an inconvenience. But I didn't say a word. I just shut my eyes, counted slow, and prayed the Lord would keep me patient. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon. Tanya had asked if she could drop the kids off for a few hours while she ran errands. I agreed, with one condition. Tanya, make sure you pick them up before my nap. I ain't as young as I used to be. Of course, Mama, she said, waving it off. You rest easy. By 1 o'clock, I had 2 tornadoes in my house. Maya was chasing the cat with a feather duster, and Jalen was using my hallway rug as a racetrack. My patience was paper thin, but I reminded myself, just 1 more hour. At 2:05, I sank into my chair, exhaling long. All right now, Nana's gonna rest. Y'all keep it down, okay? Jalen nodded. Maya pouted. The TV flickered quietly. For about 7 blessed minutes, peace returned. Then came the screams. Not cries, screams of laughter. Loud, shrill, wild. The kind that rattles your teeth. I jolted up, heart racing. I stumbled toward the noise, only to find the kids jumping on my bed, my late husband's side of the bed, tossing my pillows like toys. I froze. Stop that right now, I said, my voice trembling. They froze too, but only for a heartbeat before bursting into giggles again. Mama's gonna be so mad, Maya said, bouncing. She said Nana don't really sleep, she just pretends. Jalen blurted. Pretends? That word cut deep. Because it meant Tanya had been mocking me, my naps, my habits, my grief. I felt my throat tighten. At that moment, my daughter's words echoed again in my head, she's not doing anything all day. That's when I knew. This wasn't just noise. This was disrespect planted and watered by my own child. That night, when Tanya returned, I was calm. Too calm. She walked in laughing on her phone, barely noticing the mess. Mama, you look tired, she said with that tone people use when they don't really care. "Oh, I am," I replied, steady. "Your children saw to that." She rolled her eyes. "Mama, they're just kids." "Kids learn what their parents teach," I said. "And mine learned to mock their grandmother's grief." She blinked, defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. Just stared at her, long enough for her to look away first. Because I realized something, my silence scared her more than my anger ever could. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the dent in Charles's pillow. I thought about every sacrifice I'd made for Tanya, the nights I worked 2 shifts so she could go to college, the time I pawned my wedding ring to pay for her first car down payment. And this? This was how she repaid me, mocking my peace, invading my sanctuary. By dawn, my tears had dried. And a strange calm filled me. Because when people underestimate you, when they forget who you are, that's when you remind them. And baby, I was about to remind Tanya exactly who raised her. 2 days later, Saturday morning, I woke up before the sun, just me, my robe, and the smell of chicory coffee filling the kitchen. It was quiet again, finally. The house was mine. The silence hummed like an old hymn. I sat by the window, sipping slow, watching the neighborhood wake up. Little Rock mornings have a special kind of peace, birds gossiping in the oak trees, a train humming in the distance. It reminded me that not everything loud had to hurt. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my neighbor, Miss Evelyn. "Clara, honey, is Tanya moving some of your things? Saw her car out front yesterday while you weren't home." My stomach dropped. I hadn't asked Tanya to come by. My spare key was for emergencies only. I tried to steady my breath, but my hands trembled. I dialed Tanya right away. She didn't answer. Tried again, nothing. By the time I got dressed and drove back from the grocery store, Tanya's car was gone. But the front door, my door, was unlocked. Inside, the house looked tidy, too tidy. My living room, usually cozy and full of small clutter, my crochet basket, Charles's old record sleeves, the family Bible on the end table, was spotless. My eyes darted to the hallway. My heart thudded as I stepped into my bedroom. And that's when I noticed it, the trunk at the foot of my bed. Charles's trunk. Where I kept his folded shirts, our letters, and, most precious of all, his army flag. The trunk was half empty. I stood frozen, staring down at it like maybe I'd wake up from a bad dream. But then, I saw the trash bag, the same kind Tanya had used last week when she cleaned the kids' playroom. I opened it. Inside were clothes, frames, and letters, things that were mine. Things that should never have left that trunk. And on top, I found the photo. The last picture of Charles and me before his heart failed him, smiling in front of the old church, sunlight hitting his uniform just right. It was bent. That's when my breath caught, and my knees nearly buckled. Tanya had been in my room. She had touched my things. Thrown out memories she didn't make. Why? I waited until evening to call her again. This time, she picked up, her voice chipper and unaware. "Hey, Mama! What's up?" "Don't hey me," I said, steady but low. "Why was you in my house yesterday?" There was a pause. "Oh, I just stopped by to help organize a bit. You've been saying how tired you are lately." I figured. Don't lie to me, Tanya. That tone, my old teaching voice, made her go quiet. I could almost hear her swallow through the phone. "Mama, I didn't mean no harm. You opened Charles's trunk. You threw out his things. They were old clothes. They smelled like mothballs. I was just trying to make space." Make space. For what? That phrase hit different. Cold. Calculated. Make space for what, Tanya? I asked again. "Mama, it's just, your house feels so cluttered. The kids need room when they visit." Room. The kids needed room. In my house. That's when it clicked. Tanya wasn't just tidying. She was clearing. Tanya, I said softly, you planning something I don't know about? Of course not, Mama. You're being dramatic. You always say that when you're hiding something, I said. She hung up. That was my answer right there. The next morning, I called Miss Evelyn. She didn't hesitate. Baby, I didn't want to stir the pot, but your daughter's been talking with that realtor lady. The one who lives over on Maple Street. My hand gripped the phone tight. A realtor? I repeated. MHM. They were outside your house Thursday evening. She said something about market value and easy sale. The world went still. It all made sense now. The cleaning. The disrespect. The mockery. Tanya wasn't just being careless, she was testing my limits. Trying to make me feel like a burden. Like I didn't deserve the peace of my own home. Why? Because she wanted the house. The one Charles built with his bare hands. The one we paid off penny by penny. The one I swore I'd never leave. That night, I sat in my recliner and stared at the family photo wall. Tanya at her wedding. Jalen's first birthday. Charles in uniform, standing proud. I whispered to the air, you'd be ashamed, Charles. I could almost hear his deep voice answer, baby, don't let nobody take what's ours. So I didn't sleep. Instead, I started searching. I went through drawers, cabinets, the trunk, anywhere Tanya might have left a trace of her plan. And tucked beneath the Bible on the coffee table, I found an envelope. My name on it. Inside, a flyer for a family estate sale. And at the bottom, written in her handwriting, Saturday, 11 a.m., final clearance. My house. My memories. My daughter's final clearance. I could feel my heart pounding hard enough to hear it. But mixed with anger, something else crept in, clarity. She thought I was old. Soft. Forgetful. She forgot who she came from. She forgot that I ran this house when bills stacked taller than I could stand, that I raised her through storms and loss, that I built every inch of this home through grit and grace. She thought she could erase me quietly. But I was about to show her, you don't erase a mother like me. That Sunday morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Jenkins, an old church friend who'd helped me handle Charles's pension. When I told him what was happening, he sighed. Clara, she doesn't have rights to your house unless your name's off the deed. It ain't, I said firmly. Then she can't sell it. But she can sure make your life miserable trying. Then let's make hers miserable first, I said, quiet but sharp. That's when the plan began to form. A slow, deliberate, righteous kind of revenge, the kind only a mother who's had enough could pull off. I decided not to confront her yet. No shouting. No scenes. I wanted her to think she was winning. That week, Tanya came by with the kids again. Loud as ever. Marcus trailed behind, glued to his phone. Hey, Mama, Tanya chirped. We brought lunch. Oh, how kind, I said, smiling sweetly. She didn't notice how calm I was. How I watched every move she made, where her eyes lingered, what she whispered to Marcus. But I saw it. That quick look toward the trunk. That smirk when she told the kids to play wherever they want. I let her think she was in control. Because when people show you who they are, baby, you don't argue, you take notes. When they left that evening, I stood in the doorway, watching their car disappear down the road. Then I locked the door, turned off the lights, and whispered to myself. It's time. Time to take back my peace. Time to teach a lesson they'd never forget. Because the next part, my revenge, wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was patient. Calculated. And devastating. For a few days, I let the hurt do its quiet work. I would wake up and stare at the trench of the lawn where Charles used to plant marigolds, thinking of how he'd whistle while he worked. I would touch the collar of his shirt in the drawer and feel the ghosts of a life we'd built. During the day I hummed along to old hymns and pretended to be calm. But at night, the notebook I kept, Arthur's ledger from years ago, filled with dates, small observations, names, and a list of things I needed to do. Revenge, I decided, wouldn't be a spectacle. I wanted it to be surgical. Not because I was mean, but because I was tired of being underestimated. First, I made a list of allies. I wasn't going to do this alone. Community is what raised me, and it was community that would help me set the record straight. There's a woman on my porch I call Miss Evelyn. She knows everything that happens 2 blocks either direction, and she's my early warning system. Then there's Mr. Jenkins, the attorney, who still owed me a favor from when he once fixed my taxes pro bono. And Pastor Louise, who runs the community support group and has a soft place for elders. I rang each of them up and told them small parts of the story, never the whole thing, because secrets are like tea, they taste different when everyone sips at once. Miss Evelyn came over that afternoon with a plate of sweet potato pie and a look that meant business. "Child," she said as we sat on the porch swing, "you ain't the first mama they ever tried to push aside, and you won't be the last. Let 'em try." I told her about the flyer and Velvet Revival. I told her about the trunk and the bank of memories that had been emptied. She cleft her tongue and said, "We'll see about that. I know a cousin who runs a thrift that specializes in vintage pieces. If your daughter's been selling, honey, we'll find receipts." Mr. Jenkins came next. He was a stout man with a voice like gravel but a heart lined with gold. He told me calmly, "Clara, legally she can't sell your house or strip your things unless you sign something. But what we can do is make sure the community knows the truth, and if there's any paperwork, we'll file for protection. Sometimes you don't have to fight on the inside, you just need the light to show what's been done." Pastor Louise hugged me and said, "Child, sometimes the righteous path is long, but the Lord don't forget who stands for what is right." That was the kind of language that steadied me. With allies in place, I moved to evidence. You don't accuse unless you can prove, and proof is what turns a rumor into a reckoning. I started by cataloging everything I could find, photographs, a receipt from a boutique I'd once bought a hat from, the brittle labels Arthur had sewn into hems with his initials. I found those initials again on the Velvet Revival listings online, small, faint, but real. I took pictures with my phone, I made copies. But evidence alone doesn't make people listen. You have to craft a story that lands in the right ears. So I began with the people who would feel it the most. I quietly reached out to women who'd once come to my house for tea, the ones who'd seen me in those dresses at weddings, funerals, graduations. I told them, gently, "Help me remember. Tell me which dresses you recall and the stories with them." They did. Their voices stitched together the past into something undeniable. Meanwhile, I watched my daughter. She was careful, but not clever enough to hide everything. One evening, through the lace curtains, I watched her on the porch talking with a young woman who looked like an influencer, perfect hair, a tablet in hand. They were laughing, and Vanessa's hand rested on the box of things she'd bought. She had a smile that wanted praise. She liked the sound of that. I could have confronted her then and there and saved myself the trouble of scheming. But confrontation is for the desperate. I wanted her to watch as the circle closed, to feel the pressure of the truth without having me be the one to shove it in her face. There's a kind of moral pressure that accumulates, it's a public weight, like humidity before a storm. Next, I planted small truths online in ways she couldn't easily dismiss. Not accusations. Just details. A post here about a vintage fabric restoration class, a comment on a local history group about preserving family garments, a throwaway mention to a friend who wrote an arts column. People started asking questions. Where did these pieces come from? Whose stories are they telling? The more questions, the thinner the veneer of Vanessa's branding became. And I used patience as a weapon. While she chased followers and paychecks, I reached out to antique dealers and consignment shops in neighboring towns. One person recognized the sewing pattern in a dress I described, a pattern only used by a local seamstress who worked with Arthur on pieces decades ago. Another remembered a distinctive button we'd only used in family garments. When I collected enough of these small confirmations, the image of my dresses being curated vintage grew shaky. I also kept a stack of receipts and emails to show Mr. Jenkins. Not because I wanted to sue, though I kept that option open, but because the very presence of meticulous records makes predators nervous. The lawyer taught me about civil complaints and slander suits in plain language. You don't file just to win, he said. You file to make them reckon. Paperwork brings consequences. One midnight, while the house hummed and the TV murmured softly in another room, I opened the ledger and wrote a letter. Not a letter to Vanessa, she'd heard the silence, but a letter to the community. I drafted a piece for the little paper we all read, a column about how heirlooms carry stories beyond fashion, about what it means when people profit off another's past. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The voice of the piece was the voice of anyone who'd ever loved and lost. It went out the next morning, anonymous as a sigh. The reaction was immediate. Comments. Phone calls. A neighbor sent a screenshot of someone tagging a friend in my column. Read this. It's about that boutique downtown. My inbox filled with people offering support, with names of shops to check, with offers to come by and help find items. I hadn't expected the town to rally so quickly, but then again, small towns tend to have long memories. I also had to think about my daughter's motivation. Sometimes the why matters more than the how. When she finally came to me, teary-eyed and defensive, begging me not to drag her through the mud, I had to resist the urge to simply unload. She needed to see how her actions hurt others, not just me, but the seamstresses who poured time into making a dress, the neighbors who loaned lace and buttons, the community that reveres memory. You took pieces of people's lives and repackaged them, I said quietly. That's not curation. That's erasure. She sniffed and offered the usual defense about bills and ambition. I just wanted to make something out of old things, Mama. You always said we have to be practical. That stung because it was half true. I had taught her to be practical because life had expected it. But practicality doesn't mean theft. The line is clear if you've ever had to survive on a budget and still keep your integrity. It was time to widen the circle. I contacted a woman I knew from the local historical society, Ms. Ortega, who helped preserve textile histories. She was sharp and kind and loved a righteous fight. When I explained, she said, "Bring me everything. If these garments are from a maker we know, we'll document and expose the provenance." She offered to bring a photographer and a historian to verify the dresses. That was the kind of corroboration you can put in front of editors and lawyers. With Ms. Ortega's help, I curated a small display at the community center titled Stitches of Our Lives. We invited the press under the guise of a celebration of local craft. I wrote the invites in my careful handwriting and sent them around like a gentle net, a net meant to catch not fish, but truth. The display day felt like a small trial. People came with their folding chairs and their warm coats. They listened as Ms. Ortega explained the particular stitching techniques and as Mr. Jenkins described the legal and ethical side of provenance. We displayed photos of the dresses on mannequins, the same cuts, the same lace, the same tiny initials that had been tucked into seams, CM for Clara Mae, hand-sewn by Arthur in his slow, clumsy script years ago. People nodded with understanding. A reporter took notes and asked questions that Vanessa couldn't easily spin into a marketing angle. Vanessa came that afternoon, uninvited and with that tight smile on her face, and the room went quiet when she entered. She had not expected an audience, not at a community center where the truth could be spoken into microphones and remembered by people who knew our history. She tried to stand and make a casual joke about family fashion, but the air had shifted. The neighbors looked at her with measured disappointment, and even some who once liked her posts turned their heads. I didn't confront her in front of everyone. I let the quiet do that job. There's a pressure to shame that comes from being gazed at by people you once relied upon for praise. Her face flushed, and her shoulders dropped as the silent verdict settled. She had miscalculated. What I had not foreseen was how much I would feel when the press picked up the story. My phone blew up with supportive messages, but it also rang with old friends and women I'd taught who suddenly reached out to tell me how proud they were. "You stood for something that matters," one woman said, and I felt a warmth settle in my bones I hadn't felt in months. Still, it wasn't over. Vanessa removed items from her online store, but the damage to our relationship wasn't so easily undone. She kept calling, pleading, then snapping with anger when I didn't respond in the way she wanted. "You're humiliating me," she would say. "You're ruining my chance." She thought the hurt she felt compared to mine, and to Arthur's? It did not. But I understood the child inside her who wanted to be seen. I also knew that being seen did not mean erasing others. That night, as I sat on the porch swing with a cooling cup of tea, I listened to the cicadas and thought about how grief changes people. Some people fold into it like paper, and others use it like a weapon. I had used mine to stitch something honest back together. There was one final move I kept in reserve, a quiet one with consequences I hoped would teach a lesson without crushing my child. I reached out to a small circle of ethical fashion bloggers who had once praised Vanessa, and I asked them a private favor: help me document and expose provenance, not to shame, but to restore rightful credit. They agreed. The week they published a careful piece, not a smear, but a fact-driven exploration of provenance, the momentum turned. People began to call Vanessa's sponsors. Partnerships paused. She faced the direct consequence of choices made for profit. But even as the town talked and the brands pulled away, my heart stayed strangely tender for her. There were nights when I imagined us in the years ahead, sewing at the same table, telling stories to grandchildren. That tenderness kept me from breaking her entirely. When the calls from brands started to slow and Vanessa's following ebbed, she finally stopped pretending. She came to me with an envelope in her hand and eyes that no longer flashed with defiance but with shame. "Mama," she said, "I'm sorry. I thought I was doing something good." Her voice broke. I watched her, thinking of all the times I'd soothed a fever, cleaned a scraped knee, sat up with a broken heart. I discovered an odd truth in that moment: revenge had not satisfied in the way I thought it would. The small victories felt hollow if they didn't also make room for repair. But repair would come in its own time. For now, the plan had worked. The house stayed mine. The trunk remained where it always had. The children, Jalen and Maya, started to learn, slowly, that Nana's nap was sacred again. They came over and whispered, "Nana, we'll be quiet," and then actually were. The calm that settled over the house was not just my doing, it was the community's reminder that some things are not for sale. The final act, the part where Vanessa had to reckon publicly with her choices, was still ahead. I had preserved my dignity in my home, but there was one more step I intended to take. Not vindictive, not cruel, simply necessary. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened the notebook where I'd kept everything: dates, receipts, names, pictures. I wrote one last note of intention and underlined it twice. Then I walked to the bedroom, opened Charles's trunk, and touched the fabric of a dress he'd once admired. I whispered into the still air, "You're home, baby. We're home." The next morning, when the sun crawled across the floorboards, I made a call. It was to someone who could make a reconciliation public in a way that could not be spun away, someone who could help turn the final act of repair into a kind of public healing. That call started the clock for part 4, the execution that would bring clarity, closure, and one last twist that would change everything for Vanessa, for me, and for the house we loved. The week following the display at the community center, I could feel the tension building like a storm. Little Rock had a way of keeping secrets close, until someone wise, quiet, and deliberate reminded everyone that truth cannot be hidden forever. That someone was me. I started by letting small hints slip into everyday conversation. In the market, I casually mentioned to shopkeepers and neighbors about how some well-intentioned renovations had gone wrong, describing missing vintage dresses and heirlooms without naming names. Each comment was a gentle prod, like water wearing down stone. By the middle of the week, the whispers began to circulate in Tanya's circles. Some neighbors knew, some suspected, and some were waiting to see how it unfolded. Then came the first direct blow. I had spent days tracking down every item Tanya had attempted to sell. With receipts, provenance, and witnesses, I had compiled a dossier. That Friday afternoon, I quietly handed a copy to Mr. Jenkins, who promised to deliver it to the boutique she'd been working with. He called her later with the news: "The provenance doesn't match. You're in possession of items that don't belong to you." Vanessa had no one to charm. The boutique froze her account, demanding verification. Her followers, once her cheerleaders, questioned the authenticity of her claims. Panic had a look, and I saw it forming across her features when she realized the net had closed in. The next twist came when I decided to orchestrate a very public confrontation, one she couldn't ignore or spin. I invited her and the family to the community center under the guise of a small tea gathering to celebrate family stories and traditions. Vanessa arrived, confident, wearing a smile she thought masked her unease. Instead, she was met with the display I'd organized, photographs of every dress, every piece of lace, every article she'd tried to profit from, alongside the witnesses and community elders ready to speak on the record. Vanessa froze. Her words caught in her throat. I stood at the back, calm, watching her scramble for an excuse. These were meant to celebrate heritage, she started, almost pleading. Heritage isn't a business, Miss Evelyn replied, voice calm but firm. You've turned memory into merchandise. The crowd murmured in agreement. The influence she had cultivated online faltered under the weight of real faces and real stories. People who had once shared her posts, commented positively, and praised her choices now shifted their gaze to me. I wasn't the old woman being mocked, I was the custodian of legacy, the one who refused to let history be erased. Then came the final twist. Among the photos, I included one special item, a dress Charles had bought for my 50th birthday, stitched with his initials and love notes hidden in the hem. Tanya reached for it instinctively, but I held it up. This, I said softly, is not yours. It never was. Her hands trembled. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The room was silent enough for the weight of the statement to sink in. The public humiliation was subtle but absolute. And the last act of poetic justice? I handed her a small envelope, the one I'd prepared weeks before. Inside, a written plan outlining how she could make amends, return items, and begin repairing the harm she caused. She stared at it like it was a foreign language. I didn't need to speak. My calm, deliberate, and meticulously orchestrated plan had already done the work. She realized the house, the memories, the love, and the trust she tried to exploit were untouchable unless she earned them back. The final twist wasn't revenge and anger, it was revenge and intelligence, patience, and dignity. She learned that the mistakes of underestimating someone who has built a life with care and sacrifice come with consequences. The shock was seeing the public acknowledgement of her actions, the community rallying, and the undeniable proof that she had overstepped. By the end of the gathering, Vanessa's posture had changed. The confidence that once filled her swagger was replaced by careful humility. She hadn't lost a single friend because of me, she had learned a lesson she wouldn't forget, the cost of dismissing the wisdom and boundaries of those who came before her. The grandkids, too, learned something, boundaries exist for a reason. As we left the center that evening, Jalen whispered, Nana, we'll never mess with your nap again. Maya nodded solemnly. I smiled, squeezing their little hands. The lesson had been taught in a way that would last a lifetime. And me? I walked home slowly, touching the edge of the gate as I entered the yard. The house was mine, Charles's memory intact, my dignity unbroken. Revenge had not been loud or cruel, it had been exact, patient, and meaningful. I brewed a cup of tea, set it on the table, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The quiet that followed wasn't just a pause. It was victory, the kind you can feel in your bones. The morning after the community gathering, I woke up to the soft sunlight filtering through the lace curtains. The house was quiet, truly quiet, for the first time in weeks. Not just the absence of noise from the grandkids or the bustle of visitors, but the absence of tension, that heavy weight that had been pressing on my chest since I discovered Tanya's betrayal. I moved slowly through the house, touching the things that had been threatened, the dresses, the photos, the old trinkets. Everything was in place. Nothing was missing. And in that stillness, I realized something important. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoration. Tanya hadn't been destroyed, she was humbled, yes, but that wasn't my goal. My goal had always been to protect what was mine and to make sure she understood the value of respect, boundaries, and legacy. And slowly, she began to get it. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa, my daughter, started returning items she had kept. Some were slightly worn, others damaged, but she approached each one carefully, apologizing to the neighbors and the community members who had lent us pieces or shared stories. I guided her quietly, explaining that accountability doesn't make you smaller, it makes you wiser. Even the grandkids started to change. Jalen stopped racing through the hallway like a tornado, and Maya no longer used my old bed as a trampoline. They learned that Nana's nap was sacred, that our home had rules, and that respect carried its own reward. The final twist, one I hadn't anticipated, came from the community. The historical society where Ms. Ortega worked invited me to co-lead a small exhibit about family heirlooms and memory preservation. People came from all over Little Rock to see the dresses, the photos, and the stories I had carefully documented. My small act of revenge had blossomed into a legacy project, connecting families and preserving histories. Tanya, of course, attended. Not smug or defensive this time, but quietly observing. She even helped organize a few displays, a small gesture, but one that showed growth. One evening, as I sat on my porch with my tea, Jalen and Maya playing quietly in the yard, Tanya approached and stood at the gate. I didn't turn immediately. I waited. Mama, she said softly, thank you. I didn't realize. I know, baby, I interrupted gently. And now you do. There was a pause. She smiled faintly, humbled. And I realized something crucial. Sometimes, the strongest revenge is teaching someone the lesson they needed, not crushing them entirely. Life returned to a rhythm I could breathe in again. The naps resumed. The house felt like a home, not a battlefield. And most importantly, I felt pride, not bitterness. I had stood firm. I had protected what mattered. I had reminded my family, and myself, that respect is earned, not taken for granted. And as for Vanessa? She learned that shortcuts through someone else's memories don't lead to real success. Every time she glanced at the dresses or touched a piece of our family's story, I saw in her eyes a little spark of understanding, maybe even gratitude. In the end, the lesson was simple: boundaries are sacred, legacy is priceless, and respect cannot be borrowed, it must be given. And as I sipped my tea, I couldn't help but smile quietly to myself. The storm had passed, the house was safe, and I, Clara Mae Richardson, had finally reclaimed my peace. Moral takeaway for viewers. Sometimes the quiet, calculated actions are stronger than anger. Protect your memories. Stand firm in your boundaries. And let karma, patience, and truth do the heavy lifting. What would you do if your family crossed your boundaries like this? Would you confront them or wait for karma to teach the lesson? Drop your story in the comments. Like if this hit home, subscribe for more wild tales, and stay tuned for the next dramatic story.